Hello and welcome to the Customer Conversations podcast. Today, I'm excited to be joined by Lorin McCann. Lorin is a strategic consultant and founder of Customer Intelligence Institute. She's worked with dozens of high-growth companies, including best-in-class startups, emerging market leaders, and unicorn companies to contribute to successful exits and record quarters. Her focus is helping business leaders eliminate something she calls the buyer blind spot with customer intelligence so they can create more profitable go-to-market strategies without the guesswork. Lorin, thanks so much for being here. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Stuart. I'm really thrilled to be here.
Of course. So one topic that we've talked about sort of leading into this, and I know you talk about a lot with your customers, which I'm sort of really curious to dive deeper into, is positioning and how companies can improve their positioning, how they're, maybe have changes that they could make to their positioning that would help them eliminate that buyer blind spot that you mentioned and help them grow more profitably and faster. So maybe you can speak a little bit about that and sort of, how positioning fits into the work that you do.
Absolutely. Positioning is, I guess it's kind of like a really common use case that pops up in working with clients, high growth B2B companies who are struggling and just like the dots aren't connecting. Maybe they've had a few quarters of really slow growth or a drop off in revenue. Usually when they're thinking about doing something like repositioning, it's just something's broken. However, sometimes nothing is broken and they will still try to reposition anyway. So going in and doing the kind of research and everything that we talk about a lot is one of the things that leads to the outcome of better positioning if it's used right and implemented in a really thoughtful way. But positioning doesn't necessarily drive customer research, if that makes sense. But there are a number of sort of like positioning mistakes that are really common and pop up so frequently with these companies. So I think it's definitely a good topic to dive into.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess, so you mentioned there that, sometimes it's you're sort of working on positioning or repositioning a company because, things aren't going as they expected. And sometimes it's because, nothing is wrong at all. So what are some of the sort of typical early warning signs for companies that they might have a problem with their positioning? Like, are there things that you sort of specifically look for, either sort of, you mentioned qualitative research when you sort of dive deep into that kind of research, or are there things that you can see sort of before you go deep on a research effort?
That's a great question. And it's sometimes it's one or the other. There are times where I can go in and start working with a company and it's very clear that there's a disconnect in terms of their positioning. Sometimes it's not obvious until we actually do the research. However, what usually triggers a repositioning initiative is just something's not working. It's like something's broken, but we don't know what. So we're going to make some changes. The other scenario is a new executive is hired, like, a company with a new CMO or VP of marketing or something, and they come in and they have this vision for what they want to do and the changes they want to make in the company. Maybe they did things differently in their last position, and so they come in with a plan and we'll go ahead and start implementing that plan without doing their due diligence. So that's unfortunately a really common scenario. It's going to happen a lot of times. In the second scenario where companies are kind of feeling the pain of knowing that the playbook that they have been using for whatever length of time, it's just not working for them anymore and they don't know why. That can also trigger a repositioning. And that's great. I think that that's an appropriate way to kind of go into a challenge like that. However, you can still get it wrong if you know that something's not working and then gather a whole bunch of executives or the marketing team behind closed doors. And I can see you smiling. So I'm sure you've encountered this before. And everyone goes in behind closed doors and brainstorms, what do we think this new positioning should be, without actually understanding what's going on in the market and with customers, and what's the reason, what is the reason why whatever we're putting out isn't resonating. And it can sometimes be that a specific product needs to be repositioned, or it could be that the brand as a whole needs repositioning. So there are some of those factors that are just so easy to get wrong. And they're also, it's simple to get it right, but it's too easy to get it wrong, because we don't really have standard procedures or a standard sort of mindset around what it looks like to really mindfully, strategically reposition a company.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And it's interesting. So you see me smiling. That's certainly something that we come across relatively often, right? Is that decisions made behind closed doors that didn't include the customer, that subsequently missed the mark on actually driving the results that you expected. Mm-hmm. So I guess the inverse of that is hopefully true, right? If we make decisions that include the customer, or get to the decisions that we make by including the customer, we should be able to sort of more consistently improve, whatever metric it is that we're typically looking at, which is maybe a question in itself. But for a company that hasn't, you sort of mentioned this, that doesn't have a standard procedure for thinking through repositioning, and I guess repositioning is just one option when something's broken, right? But what's sort of the first step that you take to help a company make better decisions that include their customers? Where's the starting point?
Yeah, okay, great question. So it's really simple. The first step is always talking to their customers, and it's not running a survey. And keeping in mind that the types of companies we work with are B2B, it's usually a complex sale. And so in other situations, customer research via surveys are appropriate, but we just skip right to actually doing customer interviews. And doing a certain volume of interviews as well. So we'll explore whatever area of their business, whatever buyer persona, let's say, that they have in mind, if they really understand their persona, or whatever level of understanding they're at with their buyer personas, we'll say, okay, which segment of your buyers are expected to drive the most revenue in the next 12 to 18 months, and then focus efforts there and really understanding the buying process, the internal decision-making process, different needs and values, which amount to buying behaviors, essentially. What's going on in that segment? And we'll have conversations. So they're anonymized to a degree. The company they'll get those transcripts back. They'll get our reports back from all of these interviews. But during those conversations, the buyers who we're speaking with have this sense of safety and anonymity, that they can really be very honest and open in those conversations. And it's just wild. I mean, I've had sales leaders look at kind of like page through the transcripts after we've done a bunch of interviews and just say, oh my God, I can't believe you got all of this information. They won't even tell us this stuff when we're on the phone, and we know these people, we have relationships. They won't even tell us this stuff, just because I think people are kind of polite and they don't want to hurt someone's feelings or divulge their internal buying process if they feel like that could be leveraged against them somehow. But that's really the starting point, is actually having those conversations and being able to actually bring actual intelligence, market intelligence, back to these teams, so that they can get the lay of the land and not just be working on guesswork or sort of data points and certain ideas and theories that are spread out in the institutional knowledge of their team. We get a chance to kind of validate or invalidate whatever internal hypotheses there are around the market, around buying behaviors. And so that's really where I start. And then from that point, the leadership at whatever company we're working with, they have to really sit with that information and decide, okay, what are our options here? How do we want to approach this? And so that's kind of the first step, but we can get into that in more detail if you think it's relevant.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so much to unpack there, and it's interesting.
Yeah.
You started this with it's so simple, right? All you have to do is talk to your customers. But for a lot of people that I know, I'm sure you talk to, that I talk to, that feels like such a huge first step, right? Such a huge undertaking to say,
Right.
okay, we're actually going to talk to our customers, even though just about any business is talking to their customers every day, right? They're just not talking to them in this context where the goal is learning and the goal is, really understanding the customer rather
Mm-hmm.
than, fixing a problem in support or, closing a sale in sales, whatever it might be. It's typically
Yeah.
not sort of this disarming conversation, which is, well, just tell me about you, right? So
Mm-hmm.
one of the things that I'm sure will be really valuable to listeners here is like, how do you start that conversation? Sort of how do you find those people? Like you mentioned, sort of picking your what you perceive to be the most profitable segment for the next 12 to 18
Mm-hmm.
months. So that sort of gives you some direction, but then how do you actually get the person on the phone, and then what do you ask them?
Yeah. Okay. Great questions. And so yes, just to address some of the things that you kind of open this next part of the conversation with. It is simple to do, but it's not necessarily easy, right? So it is pretty straightforward, but this is something I struggled with for years as well, because I did not start out engaging in this process in a really effective way, just because it's unfortunately not very common to have habits in place around qualitative research. And I should mention the interview that we did. That's the topic of the interview that we did. So anyone listening should check that out as well. So basically, what you want to do when you're thinking about who should we interview, again, I always start out with who are the most high value buyers in the next 12 to 18 months. That really simplifies things, because some companies have lots of segments, buyer segments. Maybe they have, a really extensive product portfolio. So we want to start with something that is that we can get results out of in a limited amount of time. So let's say in under a quarter, we want to go in and explore a certain segment and be able to come out with really actionable data. So the way that we actually get those people on the phone, once we've identified, okay, this is who we want to talk to, we'll just incentivize them with gift cards. Like, it's very, very simple. And this is something that there's some debate, or I think differences in opinion with different people who do this kind of customer research. Some will say, no, don't incentivize. I think when you're working with really early customers and you're still trying to find product market fit, and you're just looking for who are our best customers, it's not as important to incentivize. These people they will want to talk to you. But as a more mature company with a larger customer base, you've found product market fit already and you're in a different phase of growth, your buyers are going to be different. And we want to have conversations with closed won and closed loss accounts. So just to level the playing field and eliminate the possibility of bias from, so who is even willing to talk to us? We want to talk to people who don't necessarily like us, and we want to talk to the people who love us. This is not a case study exercise. This is really objective what's going on. So we want a mix of those interviews and that feedback, and get them on the phone. I find that it's really important to incentivize with a gift card, and think about what level that buyer is at. If it's an executive, think about what might their hourly rate be. If you want to get them on the phone for a half hour, 40 minutes, compensate them in a way that makes sense and is worthwhile for their time and feedback. So that's how we get them on the phone, and it's like an outbound, like sales outreach, essentially, to do that recruiting. And typically, the easiest way to go is to just recruit from the existing customer base. So like from accounts that you've already closed. Don't ever try to go and do an interview with like, a deal that's still in play. Everything needs to already be closed won, closed lost. And so that's kind of just like the basic mindset and methodology around actually going and getting those interviews.
Totally. Yeah. I think it's interesting to bring up there the difference where it really depends what type of company you're working with, what stage of the company are these customers interacting, or sort of at what stage is this company, and sort of what's the maturity of the customers with that company, right? Like, are they longtime customers? Are they people who have, like, how they view the company, right? It sort of really impacts how you recruit. So to sort of tie this back to positioning, and sort of talk about sort of what actually happens in this interview, what are the things that you need to ask in the interview, the questions you need to ask that will actually help inform positioning?
Right.
And this is going to be I don't want to make any assumptions here, but I have some thoughts. But anyway, how do you make sure that you're actually getting the information or the data in an interview to make sure that you can inform positioning decisions?
Yeah, so it's a great question. And I actually don't typically go into these interviews with a scripted list of questions, that's probably an intimidating idea for people listening, is to go into interviews like this without a scripted list of questions. And the reason for that is that this should feel more like a conversation. It should be an actual conversation. And one of the reasons that this type of qualitative research in an interview format is so valuable is because we're getting rich context. And so just to clarify a little bit more, when in the context of this idea of customer research, we really focus on the buying experience. So not the customer experience, not the user experience. What was the buying experience like? And so one of the levers, I guess, in getting that feedback about positioning is just that we're really focusing on the buying experience. So not going into what was onboarding like, what's it like using the product, that might come up a little bit, but it's not the focus. The focus is what prompted, like what was going on at your company internally at the time that you began your search. So that's the one opening question. This is something that Adele Ravella, who of the Buyer Persona Institute, she uses this kind of methodology, and I think it's a great way to go in and to keep it open and capture insights that you maybe didn't even think to ask for. So you just kind of hold that space and guide the question. It's really like the conversation that we're having right now. Now, the caveat, though, is that you need to have someone who's comfortable leading a conversation in that way. So I will kind of know what kind of gaps I need to fill in for that particular company. Where is the blind spot the most? Where are we kind of sensing that like blind spot the most? Is it we don't know how many people are really on the buying committee, or we're losing all these deals at the 11th hour and we don't know why. They never tell us, why. They just ghost us. It's crazy. So with some of that information ahead of time, I can kind of understand how I want to guide the conversation or bring in backup questions. But I don't go in with a whole list of questions because it can just feel like an interrogation. But you really have to have someone who's practiced enough and comfortable enough using that format. So for a company who's trying to do this internally or, themselves, it's fine to have a list of questions. Just, don't be afraid to go off script if that's where the conversation goes.
Totally. Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. And it's interesting you bring that up as like the first thing, right? It's like, it's one of the things that I always get asked when I'm working with clients or working with companies doing interviews is, what are you going to ask them? Which is a hard question to answer because you don't know until you get into to the interview, right? Like you have some guardrails and you have, maybe a list of questions that you're trying to answer, right? Like sort of what are the goals, or like what, and not really what are your goals, but where are the gaps, right? You mentioned this around like how many people are on the buying committee, or how, other questions sort of that nature. But yeah, it's interesting when sort of talk to a lot of people doing these interviews, and the answer is never, well, I asked this question, then that question, then that question, right? It's a lot of,
I would love to do it. Yeah, I would love to do it that way, because it would be so much easier to kind of process all of the feedback. I mean, it's a lot of going through the transcripts and looking for patterns. So in some ways, it would be easier to do it that way, but the intel and the feedback is not necessarily going to be as high quality in that sense. And so also in terms of guardrails, actually, I almost forgot to mention this, but this is really important, is when you're doing research into the buying experience or customer experience, buying experience, user experience, do not combine these interviews or case studies, for example. This is something that comes up a lot as well, is we'll just pull from case studies. But your best customers or your marquee accounts or whatever don't necessarily reflect the same experiences or needs or behaviors that your buyers in the next, again, like 12 to 18 months are going to be expressing, or what they're going to be needing from you. But I do keep in mind during these interviews about the buying experience, different stages of awareness. So I want to start out with what was going on internally that prompted this search for a solution, and understand what was driving that search, and then just go on to sort of problem awareness, solution awareness, and understand what is happening at each of those critical junctures. Where are there holes in the process? Where are things not making sense? And so coming back to positioning, this is where it starts to become very clear if there are gaps in positioning, or if it's not working well, because there will be confusion about, it could be about the product, it could be about the company. There's just some kind of disconnect. And if you hear your buyers, if they're not mirroring back to you in these interviews what you're putting out, or what you think you're putting out into the world, and not mirroring it back to you in a way that is positive, then that's a really good sign that there's something that needs to be adjusted and repositioned.
Yeah, I think I really like that way of thinking about it, that what your customers say about you should be what you say to your customers, right? And so that's a sort of a great sort of, I guess, connecting the dots between the research and the qualitative interviews that you're doing with sort of how that actually impacts positioning. So one thing that I'm always curious about, and this often comes up, is, okay, we've done whatever it is, 10, 20, 50 interviews, however many we've done, but we have hundreds or thousands of customers. How can we know that what shows up in these transcripts is actually representative of the larger group, and sort of how confident can we be that we should actually go and change our website, or change our sales deck, or like change the target segment that we're going after, or the target accounts that we're going after in the sales process? How do you sort of handle that with customers? Or what would you say to somebody who maybe has that objection that this can't possibly be enough data?
Right. I totally understand that, because that was actually my mindset before I really started doing this work exclusively. So I haven't always done customer research. I have a background in sales and marketing for almost a decade, where this problem pops up consistently, but I didn't always know how to tackle it. I knew it was an issue. I knew we needed to put more energy into understanding what was happening in the market. And so when I started really thinking seriously about, okay, this is a skill set that I need to have. This is before Customer Intelligence Institute. I was concerned, like, oh my God, how many interviews do we actually have to do? I mean, like, it's mind-boggling and really overwhelming to think about. But in practice, I found that about 10 to 12 interviews per segment actually works beautifully in most cases. And once you kind of get to that level, the patterns will become very, very clear. So recently, a project we did with a high growth B2B company. I mean, like very, very well known, like explosive growth, really cool what they were doing. But that started to slow down. And so we came in and did this project with them. And so they wanted to start out with 3 different segments, kind of how they were dividing their market into like SMB, mid-market, and enterprise, and by job title, which is a really common way to think about segmenting buyers, because that's how we can do it. That's the best we can do based on quantitative data, I think, is job title, industry, company size. So we start there. We start there with those segments and kind of just see what shakes out. And it's almost never the actual buying behaviors that come out of it are almost never the same as the buckets that they've been segmented into.
Right.
But time and time again, like after about 10 to 12 interviews in each segment, those patterns will emerge, and they might kind of, you'll see them to kind of reorganize into different buckets, different behavioral driven profiles. But it really doesn't take too much more than that. If, however, after doing 10 to 12 interviews in each segment, it's still a little bit fuzzy, that's when you want to move on to surveys. And that's when using surveys to supplement this really context-rich foundation that you have with the customer interviews. So it's still quite a lot of work and investment if you've never done it before and you're just figuring out as a company, how do we make this happen? It can be kind of a bigger lift the first time you do it. But it's actually, it doesn't take as much work overall as it might, it might seem in the beginning before you've kind of done the process.
Right. Yeah, that's certainly been my experience as well, that sort of there is the number of interviews, exact number of interviews is not always the same, but relatively early on, and typically earlier than you would expect, the patterns start to emerge. And it becomes, once you start hearing the same thing over and over, you're sort of at the point where you can move on to the next thing. So one thing that I sort of want to tie all this together, you mentioned at the very start of this about buyer personas. And you just mentioned sort of here, like creating new behavior-driven profiles that often differ from what you might have got out of quantitative data. So what does the output of all this qualitative research look like that, ultimately an executive can look at and say, okay, I see this is not what we had before. We're going to make a change. What goes into that behavioral profile?
Yeah. That's a great question. So the way that we do outputs is very tailored to sales and marketing use cases, and at the executive level, strategic positioning as well. So we'll put together something called a buying committee profile or target account profile that has an overview of the entire buying committee. Because we're able to get intel on what's happening within the entire buying committee from these interviews. So we'll put those together. And again, it's very different from how we think about traditional buyer personas, which is, again, job title and company size and industry and demographic info, and very like, what do they think about the product? Oh, this whatever IT director loves using XYZ solution, for whatever reason. And it's usually made up, or it's from very limited data that we get from sales. When we look at the behavioral profile, we look at what's motive, like really what are the differences in drivers and how these different buyers approach the buying process. So what usually shakes out is that we'll have a mix of job titles and company sizes that actually, and executives, users, whatever, from different company sizes and they will actually fall into the same behavioral bucket, which means that the content that you want to drip them, the messaging, the sales and marketing messaging is the same, and the job title and company size and industry might be completely different. But really we find out what's right for this specific group of buyers it's just not what we thought it was before. So it's very helpful to get that clarity and understand that that really true buying behavior doesn't come down to job title, or something like that, as simple as that. It would be so nice if it did, it would be so much easier for marketing and demand gen and everything, but it just usually doesn't shake out that way.
Right. You have to go much sort of peel back the layers of the onion, so to speak, to really get to that depth. So we've talked about so much great stuff here. You've talked about so much great stuff here. And sort of to wrap this up and sort of address something that we've talked about already, but that sort of getting started with this kind of customer research can feel like such a big undertaking. What's the one piece of advice that you would give, an executive at a company that is starting to see their growth slow down, that's starting to see, revenue flatten off? What's the one thing that you would tell them to help them either get started with this or hire somebody like you? What's sort of the first step in the process?
Yeah, I would tell them not to panic, first of all, because sometimes when things start to fall apart, it just means congratulations, you've made it to this growth milestone, and you just need to update your playbook. It's not that you were doing something wrong necessarily this entire time. It's just the market has shifted, something has changed externally, and it's just time to upgrade and figure out what that is. So really the advice that I would give, don't panic and go engage with your market and actually have conversations before making any changes, before going into that room and closing the door and freaking out. Often it's really just they've been doing a lot of things right and there have been changes and they just need to get back in touch with what's happening outside and go from there.
Great. Yeah, that's certainly really succinct. I think a great takeaway from this conversation. So finally, for people who want to learn more about you, who enjoy this conversation, want to talk more about it, where should they go to find you online?
Yeah, they can find me on LinkedIn, and my first name is Lorin. If you want to find me, you can go to customerintelligenceinstitute.com to learn more about customer research and all of the fun outputs of this kind of qualitative research.
Amazing. Well, thanks so much for joining me. This has been really, really great.
Likewise. Thanks for having me, Stuart.
The Customer Conversations podcast is brought to you by the team at LearnWhy. LearnWhy integrates with all of your customer-facing tools to organize feedback and extract actionable insights. Empower your team to start growing your bottom line today with insights from qualitative data powered by LearnWhy. You can find out more at either learnwhy.co or by emailing our team at sales@learnwhy.co. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Customer Conversations podcast. If you or someone you know has expertise in growth, marketing, or product, please have them reach out to either Sean or Stuart to learn more about becoming a guest on our show. Our team can be reached by email at support@learnwhy.co.